Faster, higher, stronger. These are the words of the Olympic motto, and they characterize in many ways the ethos behind the founding of the modern Olympics. It's easy to think of the Olympic Games, which are going on right now as I record this, as being one amongst many sporting spectacles, that in some way they are comparable to the World Championships. But it's an interesting thing, isn't it? For some reason we hold the Olympics in higher regard than we do other athletic competitions, even World Championships. And the reason for this is to do with the man who founded it, at least the modern Olympic Games, Pierre de Coubertin. He was a baron from France, and in the late 19th century, up until the kind of early to mid 20th century, he worked extensively upon founding the International Olympic Committee and the Olympic Games. And for him, the Olympic Games were more than a sporting event. Indeed, they were, in his view, a spiritual or religious event. We can see this in his writings, of which there are many have survived, from various speeches that he gave. And what should be noted is, although there is a degree of development and progression in his ideas, from the very beginning, in 1894, when he addressed for the first time the meeting of the International Olympic Committee, he described the Olympiad, or Olympic Games, as having a spiritual centre. And what I want to do in this video is maybe touch upon why he thought that. What was the spiritual and religious vision that Coubertin had for these games, and how that was inspired by the example of the ancient Greek Olympic Games and pan-Hellenic Games, but also how that then has shaped the modern Olympics in various ways that we don't even think about, but they're there in the ceremonies. And it should be noted as well, I think, that this is Coubertin's decisive and most important contribution in setting up these games as an institution that would go on for over 100 years now. There were prior attempts. So, for example, you find in England during the 1850s, a fellow called Brooks sets up the Much Wheelock Games in around the northwest of England, and you have various other games popping up. This comes with a revival of sport within England and Britain more broadly, such as the founding of many football teams and so on. In Greece, in 1859, 1870 and 1875, you have an initial attempt at Olympic Games. But what these attempts lacked was a unifying vision reflected in decisive organisation and institutional arrangements which could produce a long-lasting legacy. Because for de Coubertin, it was not just an athletic activity, this was something which could save the world. So de Coubertin, or Pierre de Coubertin's ideas really draw a lot of influence from his study of the ancient Greeks. And he notes that many people talk about the ancient Greeks for their philosophy, for their artistry, such as in the Greek tragedies, and figures like Wagner and Nietzsche try to draw upon the ancient Greeks and their insights and bring them in to the modern world, at least in a form applicable to the Germans, let's say. And Coubertin's point was actually they're missing something very important in ancient Greek culture, and that were the Olympic Games, which took their origin, most sources would say 776 BC, so before the birth of Christ, but there are other dates around that time that could be possible. But it's at least in the 8th century BC. And over time they became part of what was known as the pan-Hellenic Games. These were a sequence of 4 games, the great sporting athletic games within the ancient Greek world. There was the Olympic Games, once every 4 years, and then you would find the Isthmian Games and the Nemean Games. These were both in the 2nd and 4th years of the cycle. And finally, the Pythian Games, which were in the 3rd year. And these took place in Olympia. Delphi was where the Pythian Games took place. The Isthmus Games took place close to Corinth, and the Nemean Games took place near Nemea. And so these became the centerpiece for religious festivals. These were not just athletic competitions as we might see it. No, they were taking place at holy sites. Olympia was a village, essentially, which had a temple complex which was uninhabited until the festival. Likewise, Pythia, Delphi, this is where the Oracle of Delphi is, and the games were devoted to Apollo. Indeed, one of the first competitions was who could sing the best hymn to Apollo. Nemea and Olympia were both dedicated to Zeus, and the Isthmus Games were in honour of Poseidon. At these games there would be sacrifices, there would be hymn singing. The athletes themselves would have to go through various religious rituals. They would have to, before even entering the games, prove that they had lived a morally worthy life. Then they would go through various cleansing rituals. They would enter into the Altis, the sacred sanctuary, and remain there for 30 days. Then when they were ready, they would make a sacred oath before the great statue of Zeus, one of the ancient wonders of the world, promising not to cheat or do anything evil in the games. Then when they went to compete, they prayed to various gods for support, looking for help in this matter, from Zeus or Apollo and so on, saying if they won that this would honour that god. And then when they actually took part, this was seen in some way as being an act of worship, and we'll get more into that in due course. So there is this kind of very strong emphasis upon the sacredness of all the activities going on here, which is supplemented by the arrival of poets and sculptors who celebrate those who win these events. This isn't just a merely athletic competition. This is a whole religious drama with a number of different factors, the priestly, the athletic, the artists, all coming together in honour of a god. Some scholars have gone as far as saying that these games were the major religious festivals within the ancient Greek world, only maybe comparable to those of the Eleusinian mysteries. So they were very important. They were the cultural climax for these people. And it's interesting when we consider this in relationship to the origin stories of many of these games. They seem to be connected to many great acts in physical deeds. Let's take, for example, the Nemean Games. Now, these are allegedly founded following Hercules, who's the great strongman, the son of Zeus, who manages to defeat the Nemean lion. Now, this lion, its skin was so strong and hard that no weapon could pierce it. So Hercules could only kill it with his bare hands. He had to wrestle it and suffocate it with his strength. So this was an act of pure manly energy, masculine power. And having completed this, there was a sacrifice given to Zeus in honour of Hercules' achievement. And so the games are said to follow this event, that they are in a way a remembering of what happened, of what Hercules had done. Indeed, they are in honour of Zeus, just as his work was. And so we could see the events within the Nemean Games, especially something like wrestling or boxing, or the ancient Greek pankration, which was essentially what we would call ultimate fighting or something like that. They were a recapitulation of what had happened before. They were a reenactment of Hercules' great triumph. And in so doing, we could say this is how they honour, but also participate in the greatness of Hercules, who following his 12 labours in some stories, of which the slaying of the Nemean lion was one, he ascended into godhood. He joined the Olympians, the great gods of the ancient Greek world. He sits on Mount Olympus with Zeus, his father. In a way, these competitors, by putting themselves fully into it, by struggling with all of their mind and bodies, were engaged in a similar process or path as Hercules had undertaken. They were on the ascent up to Mount Olympus. And indeed, some of the great competitors, some of the great victors in the Olympics and other games were honoured as semi-divine. Theogenes of Thasos was arguably the greatest boxer and wrestler and pancration athlete that has ever existed. He won over 1,000 crowns. Now, I should say that the crowns, these laurel wreaths, they were given, they had different plants maybe that would be given at the different games, but they were the sign of the winner of the competition. There was no other prize other than this, which emphasizes again, it's not about monetary reward, although that would be coming afterwards from those who had sponsored you in your city, those who you represented, but rather it was about the winning, which in itself was the honouring of the gods. The point was the competition, not the reward, as it were. He won over 1,000 crowns, so that's not just contests, that's whole competitions. And after his death, many statues were erected around ancient Greece, and indeed he was honoured even abroad in barbarian territories. And it was said that his statues could have healing properties. There is a sense then in which someone like Theogenes followed the path of Hercules. He entered into it, he imitated it, and it became not just a physical act which he was engaged in, but a spiritual one which both honoured the gods and led him into and towards union with the gods. Now, this is all things which may have contributed to Coubertin's understanding of the ancient Olympics. He doesn't go into nearly as much detail as I have here, but he does point out the sacred nature of the ritual, and that it wasn't just an athletic competition, but it incorporated the arts and worship and so on. And in his view, the ancient Olympics were really a celebration of the ancient Greek view of reality. That the religious impulse is not towards the afterlife. It's not about going to heaven and living in eternal rest, in everlasting rest. Indeed, such a concept doesn't really exist in the ancient Greek mythology. Rather, the next life for most people is in Hades, which is a shadow realm where we're less than we are here. Rather, the ancient Greek view is a celebration of the human in the present life. And this is seen in the harmony between the mind and the body, the perfect balance between the two, the cooperation of intellectual greatness and creative brilliance with muscular strength. And these two things come together in the athlete. The athlete has to put forth both their powers of mind and body to be able to win a competition. And indeed, when they do so, they are most fully present. They have that joy of life, the joy of risk, the thrill of the moment. They are not thinking through what they're doing. They live in instinct. And they are most fully actualized, we might say. And so for Coubertin, this philosophy is that which brings us to the vital spark in life. It most fully makes us alive. We're constantly looking for authenticity in this day and age. Well, in a sense, Coubertin's saying, if you want that, if you want to feel most fully whole and become more fully whole, then it is through this sort of athletic competition. And so he believed that the Olympics needed to be revived because this was lacking in the modern world. The spirit had been seen in England to a certain extent. He believed that the great educator Thomas Arnold, the headmaster of Rugby School, had changed the British Empire by making the boys undergo a physical regime, that they had physical sports, field activities and so on, which then, because of this wholeness that these boys achieved, because they were disciplined into a harmonious relationship between mind and body, that they would be able to go on and expand the British Empire and rule a quarter of the world. And as an aside, he was confirmed in this opinion by the Prime Minister William Gladstone. But he believed that while this has obviously worked for the British, that this should be expanded to the whole world. And so the Olympic Games in part were to convey this spirit, or return it, and give the youth of the world an opportunity to find this healthy way of living. But it's not enough just to have the athletics then. What's needed with that is the beauty which came with the ancient Olympics, the beauty and reverence. And this comes through the presentation of the event. It's not just a series of competitions. We have an opening ceremony where athletes swear an oath, no longer to the ancient Greek gods, but rather on their flags or on their countries, that they will be honest and they will do their best. Moreover, we have the medal ceremonies. This was not a given. Indeed, in ancient Greece there was only the laurel wreath given to the winner, but here we have a reverent ceremony with medals dished out and then national anthems performed. We have great music performed at these events, such as Beethoven's Ninth Symphony or the Olympic hymn. And these things all work together to elevate these events into a quasi-religious activity. Indeed, Coubertin would say that Olympism is a religion. What's more, though, than all of this, I think, is that for Coubertin there's a specific attitude which accompanies the Olympics, or Olympism, which is missing from a lot of competitive sport. And it's really connected to his notion that it's an amateur activity, that the Olympics aren't for material reward. We've already mentioned that in the ancient times, most athletes, well, the competitions were not for a material gain. You weren't going to win money, although you would be rewarded by those you represented when you got home, but actually it was for the prize itself, for the competition itself. And in the same way, the modern Olympics, until this time, did not give monetary reward to those who were competing. And for him, this is important because fundamentally, the Olympics is not about winning at all costs. And this might sound quite a strange thing, and he's definitely not saying that people shouldn't try their best and shouldn't try to win over their opponents. But he thinks there's an athletic attitude which is far more important, and it's expressed in the Olympic Creed, which reads, "The important thing in life is not the triumph, but the fight. The essential thing is not to have won, but to have fought well." For Coubertin, that is expressed in the ancient Olympic amateurism, and it's expressed in the modern day amateurism. Because the fact is, it's not about necessarily overcoming all of your opponents. You honour the gods when you do your best, or in the modern day, you honour yourself, you are most fully alive when you embrace the struggle, when you are engaged in the struggle above all else. And this is true of life and of athletics. Now, this has come under some criticism because it essentially rules out professionalism, which is for monetary reward, your sporting competition. But also, it seemed that his idea of the ancient Olympics as being purely amateur is not necessarily the case. There seems to have been some payment for people, both after the Olympics and also in terms of sponsorships. But more than that, it seems that this idea did not belong in the ancient Olympics. There was a win at all costs mentality, that so much so that some athletes were praised for their boxing. What they did was, rather than try to attack their opponents, they would tire them out by running around the ring so long until their opponent couldn't keep up anymore. This is not somebody who's engaged in the struggle for struggle's sake, who's not stepping forward and trying to hit their opponent even if they might lose. This is somebody who's trying to win at all costs. Another story tells of a pancration competitor who was being suffocated by his opponent, and though he could have submitted at any point, he tried to get the win, and he'd rather die trying to get the win than otherwise. And so, as he was about to die, he managed to break his opponent's ankle or toe. This forced his opponent to submit just as his life expired, and so the man who died was still the victor. This value of struggle is an end in its own self, is maybe something which had its seeds in the Olympic ideas, but it seems much more reminiscent of northern pagan barbarian cultures, such as those of the Norse and the Saxons. The idea of the Drengir, who desires a fair fight, even if it means he loses, seems much closer to this. And that idea gets carried over into the chivalric traditions of knights who would fight fairly and put in effort for its own sake, and seeing that the joust was worthwhile even if they lost. Carried forward into later eras and reimagined in the modern Olympics. Nonetheless, though, that seems to be an important aspect for Coubertin. And so the increasing professionalization of these sports somewhat undercuts his initial ideas. Moreover, perhaps another aspect here is the beauty of the Olympic Games and the ceremonies around it. For Coubertin, he was very inspired by John Ruskin, the 19th century British Victorian writer, who had argued that we need to beautify society because external beauty reflects an internal beauty. And indeed, we might say that it's a mutually reinforcing process. If we're living in beautiful surroundings, it's actually going to inspire in us a requisite virtue. Whereas if we live in an ugly world, we ourselves will become more ugly. And likewise, the uglier we are, the uglier our world will be as well. And Coubertin applied that to athletics and said, actually, we need a beautiful form of sport rather than just a functional and technical one. And so costume is important, the design of the medals, the Olympic flame. All of these things are not just accidents, they're part and parcel of trying to create a beautiful event which uplifts the souls. And indeed, the very act of sport for Coubertin is beautiful. The motion of the human form as it competes and as it does amazing things. Think of like the gymnastics, for example, the twists and tumbles in the air. It can look amazing and elegant. It's beautiful. And so it changes both the athletes and us who watch. So I think we can see from this that there is a very strong spiritual aspect or religious aspect to the founding of the Olympics. And it should be said, though, that there was a few changes that Coubertin added. He didn't just take over the ancient Greek idea. He didn't just try to revive an empty form or take on its spirit entirely. He changed it in two ways, recognizing the secularism that had arisen in the 19th and 20th centuries. He put the emphasis on a religion of peace and internationalism. that the Olympic Games in the ancient world had had a truce whereby people would not fight during the games. Now, this is his own interpretation. He's stretching it. Really, the truce was that people would not attack those travelling to the games. But nonetheless, the idea of the truce in the ancient Olympics translates into a modern context of seeking peace in the world. And at the same time, this notion of internationalism, so it's not just a Greek event, but one for the whole world, and it's a democratic event that everyone has the opportunity to compete if they are good enough. So it's not one that excludes you based on class or wealth or something like that. These things he wanted to put at the heart of the Olympic religion, or Olympism, combined with this rugged, powerful form of the human balance of mind and body. And we see this in some of the aspects of the Olympic Games today. I would say that the fact that the song Imagine keeps getting played at Olympic Games, despite the fact it talks about dismantling countries and so on, the point of why that's included is it because it expresses a value of peace, and it expresses the value of the peoples of the world coming together in peaceful unity to celebrate humanity. And while parts of that song would go against the thrust of Coubertin's ideas, he still would, I think it still conforms in part with what he was trying to say. So that is a kind of summary, I think, of where the modern Olympic Games come from, their ancient roots, and how Coubertin really saw Olympism as a religion and was inspired in some ways by the ancient Greek ideals, which to my mind are even more powerful than his own. This idea that you are imitating the activities, the events completed by the great heroes and gods of old, and in some way you are elevated into that life through your own victories, through your own achievements in the athletic sphere, is a very powerful and dynamic and elevates what happened into a form of worship that transcends anything a secular perspective could give. So that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say in the comments. Look forward to hearing from you. Bye for now, friends.